apologies everyone again. And still good. We see one nope. Monica, everything's working now, if I'm not mistaken. So then I suggest we start.
The video is not working.
The video is not working. That is, maybe you can.
I don't want to do anything next.
Start video.
Okay, you have video right now? I think it is because we switched, it's probably because we switched audio sources. So then the video moves with it. Welcome everyone. I'm sorry, you might have double video, that's a bit excessive. Welcome to this webinar on lean portfolio management. Thank you for signing up. My name is Koen Harbers, and I'm a consultant with the Gladwell Group. And I'm here joined by...
I'm Jorden Vogel, and as is Koen, I'm also a consultant at Gladwell Group, and very excited to share with you about lean portfolio management. So before we start, I would like to do a short poll and see what you are about and what scaling model you're actually using. So when scaling modeling, I mean agile scaling model. So if everything's correct, also technically speaking, you'll see a poll popping up right now. So please indicate what scaling model you use. So we have 4 respondents. So scaled agile framework, okay. Some use Spotify, an own operating model. Okay, that's interesting. Let's wait a few more seconds and then I think everyone answered. All right, so the majority is familiar with SAFe. That's good. That's also where we have the majority of our experience in. All right, that's a nice indication.
So yeah, at the same time, I think it's good to note that what we're sharing here in this webinar is not exclusive to SAFe, although some of the things are based on it, but we'll touch up upon it later in this webinar. Let's start by sharing the reason why we're here today. Now you need to end the poll. Yeah. Okay, so you might have signed up for this webinar for many different reasons. But just one of those might be that you've experienced firsthand how difficult it will be to get something big and complicated done in your organization. So if this is the case, you're not alone. 67% of strategic initiatives failed, and actually the same result of 2016, or it's the same survey, also cites that half of the reasons that executives point to are a lack of communication. So either the goals are not well understood, or insufficiently aligned across the organization. So other causes might be related to budget and leadership. But what I find interesting is that a sort of similar result is reported by John Doerr in his book, Measure What Matters, where he says that this lack of communication can be found at all levels, with only 7% that fully grasps the expectations of individuals and teams for executing on a given strategy. So for a closer look at the factors leading to poor execution, it's easy to understand how a lack of alignment around common goals can create inertia. As everyone can interpret priorities to his liking, interests of subunits in the organization might be completely at odds with one another. Think, for instance, of a marketing team that fights over customer experience improvements, whilst at the same time, the sales unit is up for signing up new customers, and and then again, there's also the quality unit that wants to see products being running without a single bug. So worst case, these kinds of discussions end up as pitfalls, end up as inertia over priorities, and in the end, even turf wars. Now, when it comes to budgets, we favor a bit broader term that includes people. So after all, in many cases, they have to do the work. And when everything becomes important, nothing really does. So we tend to start everything, but rarely finish a job, which is a second pitfall in strategy to execution. The survey actually misses one, which we consider to be a vital point as well, is the lack of short-cycled feedback to the organization. It's the absence of reliable and timely feedback on the results of the strategic direction. So this leads to blindly executing on a strategy instead of iterating on it. And it might actually point to a bias with the respondents themselves. So what do you consider lean portfolio management? I think the simplest definition that we can give is balancing multiple initiatives, or balancing limited resources across multiple initiatives. And traditionally, this can be realized by managing large projects and programs. But as we teach our organizations to be more agile and less reliant on these big projects, to meet the challenges of a VUCA world, the decision-making power is decentralized more. And thus, a stronger connection between company strategy is needed to connect the teams. So which is why we see the aforementioned problems as problems with how companies manage their portfolios. But when we talk about balance, we actually assume an imbalance, and that's what we see in most of the companies what we're asked to investigate. So what we see is that there are far more initiatives than the budget, the people, the resources are able to cope with. And there's one thing else, initiatives and resources have a completely different nature. So on the one side, you have initiatives with, in most cases, an almost abundant supply of good ideas. But they're mostly estimate-based, both on the benefit side as well as on the cost side. On the right-hand side of this equation, on the people and resources side, you'd have a limited supply, which are mostly based on actuals. You either have them or you don't have them. They're not that easy to get by in the market. So the portfolio management team then tries to achieve this balance by taking up 3 different tasks. So one definitely is the longer term task is to bring people, skills, and resources in line with the structural demand of the organization. But a second and often overlooked one is on the short term, is to avoid the overload of demand that floods the organization if nobody does it. So if everything becomes important, everything is started, etc., this will land in the laps of teams and they wouldn't know how to choose. And if they don't know how to choose, they're just going to find their own ways. And even in many of the cases, this leads to the same inertia that I mentioned before, is where teams just do a little bit of everything to satisfy everyone that asks something of them. So managing this overload of demand is usually the first thing that we tend to look at within a portfolio team. Another one is to ensure that everyone is able to maximize their contribution to company goals. As we assume a misalignment in specialists, in teams, in capacity versus what is required from a strategic perspective alone, we often see that not all teams are affected in the same way. Not all their work is aligned in some big project or program. And therefore, somehow they need to understand how they can still contribute to those company goals. And this is a third task of the portfolio management team. So what we've seen is an evolution of approaches to tackle these problems. First of all, there's the traditional kind of command and control approach, where in the hierarchical approach, decision-making is centralized in the form of projects. And through that, vertical alignment can be achieved relatively easily. But many companies by now find out that in order to compensate for the slow execution of projects driven by stop-start natures, they want to have faster execution, and they've moved to agile. But when they move to agile, they come across 2 new types of challenges. So one might be that teams have little awareness of the broader company strategy and merely execute based on the work largely defined by others for them. So that's one side, and that's what we call here feature factories. It's the one that I've listed because in most big companies that I've seen, this is the most foremost challenge that actually the whole system faces. The other one which would be another end of the extreme, and is not depicted here, but certainly present in some companies, it's a kind of loose cannon agile teams. It's the teams that have complete autonomy to define and execute, but there appears to be almost nothing that connects them to the larger company goals, which create a tricky situation for both for the company itself, as you do not know if the teams are aligned, but also for the teams themselves, because they do not know if they're actually performing on the right measurements, on the right company goals. So when budgets are again asked, and the managers ask them what their contribution has been to strategy and they can't answer it, that creates a kind of uncertainty that you also don't want to have. So instead, many companies are now moving from the first stage, which is delivery agile. It's typically the first stage any company invests in, to more of an enterprise agile approach, where you create context-aware teams and work towards alignment all across the organization. So the focus is not only on faster execution, but as much as on executing on the right things. And when all the teams are aligned and are aware of what the company strategy is, you'll see that motivation increases in those teams as well. They found a sense of purpose. And it also creativity flourishes, because now you don't have to pinpoint every little detail to execute a certain plan. You can just show them what it is that you try to achieve, and they can come up with the solutions themselves. By the way, we started relatively quickly to catch up perhaps of the technical difficulties. What we failed to make clear, by the way, is if you have any questions, just let them know through chat, and Jorden here will keep a close eye, and we'll try to answer some of those in the meantime. So now the question becomes, how do you do this? How do you make sure that everyone stays aligned in the organization? If you then look at some of the frameworks, and I saw SAFe listed in there, I saw Spotify, I think most of the practices that we'll share here today are equally viable in any skilled agile situation. But it is, at least according to me and Jorden here as well, he would definitely agree, is of the skilled agile frameworks out there, SAFe probably provides the most guidance for these particular problems. So each scaling system will have its own preference of what it describes really well and best. And I know of many different almost religious debates between frameworks. But I'm trying to see what I want to use best in any given situation. And I think SAFe, when a portfolio management system, describes many things best. So they classify lean portfolio management to be the result of strategy, operations, and lean governance. That's the three triangles that they highlight. So operations describes the need to support an organization in place, and talking from experience definitely helps to assign certain key roles to facilitate the meetings, to chase the individual contributors, and make sure that everybody leaves there with a sense of commitment from those meetings and doesn't divert from anything that has been decided in them. So lean governance then describes how to measure the success of your actions, and it also details, at least according to SAFe, the dynamic budgeting rhythm. So rather than building everything on a yearly budget plan, try to do that more frequently. But that's a topic that we'll touch later. We'll continue by focusing on the top triangle, which is where some of the more interesting mind shifts take place. So as we link strategy to execution, we like to talk about strategic flow. The term flow comes from lean, and it describes the continuous stream of work. So linking strategy to execution in this way requires several shifts in how typically organizations handle things. So first of all, in the strategic planning process, it should be viewed as to be able to mobilize everyone instead of just a single few that get to guide a big program, for instance. So it needs to allow a stream of small steps as well to guide the way, instead of big projects that are locked in for a couple of years with fixed budgets. So if you operate on such a more keeping options open strategy, continuous feedback of what you're actually achieving becomes far more important than upfront analysis. So I think this is self-evident to some of the product development world and those that are already familiar with Agile, like most of you are. But if you're in a more strategic or management position, this is not as self-evident. And this is what we usually get back, is that it's difficult to really change the hearts and minds of the managers in the boardroom and in the strategy room that actually define the strategy. In order to make the organization as a whole more agile and be able to follow all those quick paths that we just discussed in strategy as a journey, a stricter separation between funding strategy and investment strategy becomes vital, because that allows you to build great teams whilst keeping the flexibility to the exact courses of action. So let's say you try strategy A first, but after 3 months, you find out that it doesn't work, that it's been the wrong thing to do. It doesn't achieve your goals. So then if everything is locked up in program budgets, you have no maneuverability. But still you have those teams out there, and they can still execute on strategy B. They just need to be taught that they don't have to wait for budget, and that it's okay that they flip from one to the other. And that requires a stable investment and stable funding area. So last is the kind of leadership and culture that's needed for this. So this can only be successful in an environment that really embraces transparency. That transparency in itself brings about a lot of difficult discussions, because you have to be clear about where your ambitions are set as compared to the other. Do I want to sacrifice a little bit of real quality management over executing really fast, like that MVP mindset in there as well? Or do I want to excel in one at the expense of the other? Rarely you can have it all. And sometimes strategy is expressed of exactly that, like having it all, and that seems to be possible, but it almost never is. Everything is a trade-off. And becoming transparent about those trade-offs is valuable for everyone in the entire system, because then they know what kind of choices they can expect and how to act in certain, when they are facing certain decisions and situations. And to make this a bit more practical is how do you make this happen? So what we see coming back in organizations is 3 associated routines. One is called the strategy routine, and this is where senior leadership discusses these strategic objectives, which are still largely annual if you're at that level, and that get translated in the portfolio routine into more quarterly objectives. And they might run on a more monthly schedule to review. And these portfolio teams then also assign the bigger work packages associated with those objectives. So let's say you have an annual objective and you translate that back to a quarterly objective. Let's say the annual objective is to capture a new market with a new app that does both sales and service. Then your quarterly objective might be related to the MVP of just sales, for instance, because servicing might be only interesting and relevant just a little bit later. So then you're building and constructing epics on just one side of the journey that can be achieved on a quarterly in one quarter, as compared to the larger strategy, and test out some of the main assumptions underlying it. And that's where the execution cycle comes in. So the execution cycle further translate these quarterly objectives into real monthly goals, and they might even operate on a bi-weekly rhythm like sprint fashion, and get the feedback that's necessary to see if what we're trying to achieve actually results in the outcomes that we planned for. And if not, then we try it back to the monthly portfolio review, and the monthly portfolio review then ties it back to the quarterly business review. So you can see this kind of endless cycle going through the organization from one team to the other. And when I say team, I don't mean that these are exactly different layers in the organizations. Rather, these might be different individuals that have a certain role in the organization, and they can operate as a subunit of one team and be present in the strategy cycle, just as they are present in the portfolio routine, and from the portfolio routine to the execution routine. So these are not exclusive teams. Rather, they're based on the task that they have at hand. But for that, we'll share some practical examples next.
Before we dive into the practical example, we see that we have a question. How to overcome a monthly objectives versus the program increment time frame.
Ah.
An example,
Yeah.
Different time frames. Good question.
Yeah, good question. And I've seen several uses for that. So it's good to know because I think because you use the term program increment, you're likely to use the SAFe framework. So the SAFe framework already talks about PI objectives as well. So you could say that the monthly objectives mirror the PI objectives, which are an aggregation of your features. So that's one side to the story. The other side to the story might well be that you define your epics and features in a way that they're less solution oriented and more objectives, key results type oriented. And that already creates well, an environment whereby you know exactly what one team needs to do and what the outcome is that it needs to reach, without knowing it, without detailing or precising too much the amount of features that are underneath it. So it could be that you set out for one team and give it, for instance, in the case of an app that's driving sales, a conversion objective. And let's say you spend 1 month to up the conversion rate from X% to Y%. So that could be then, it could translate back to an epic on your board, to a feature on your program board, etc. So it's a matter of how you translate it to your Kanban, how you translate it to your PI event.
All right. So another question before we, where is the customer represented in this model? Also 3 circles.
Yeah. So I can understand where the question, where's the customer represented in this model? I think the customer is the only one that can give feedback. So definitely this is one highlight in the quarter of lean portfolio management. And next to that, obviously there's the means and how to get that feedback, which will be customer surveys, which might be data collection methods, A/B testing, all that stuff that you need in order to get validation from the market. So that's where the customer is positioned. It's actually in the feedback loop itself. Secondly, they look linear. I've already tried to move away from stacking them up from one to the other. But I do think that there's always a difference in terms of when you look, even as one single team, it might still operate on these 3 routines, whereby in one routine, it really looks with a set of different tools towards their annual objectives, just looking a little bit further out and understanding what the roadmap could look like in the near future. And at the same time, govern their own backlog by translating that back to more quarterly objectives, and then translating it in their sprint plannings. So in effect, and that's what I tried to explain, thanks for asking, is one team can have all these different roles in both a strategy routine, the portfolio routine, and the execution routine. It becomes more a matter of how complex the situation is, whether these will be different layers in your organization or not.
All right. Also, so maybe we can also explain a little bit more by giving a practical example. So here we have a practical example of a high-tech equipment company. So here we're talking about a company that generates large machines with hardware and large software components. Before we started this, we set up a few design principles, where the most common and most important here in this picture as well is a synchronized cadence, which of course the SAFe people that are joining are familiar with. So what we did there then is we created several tables on each of the different levels we discussed. And here we have 4 tables that are groups of people with a fixed inner circle and a more flexible outer circle that are relevant stakeholders that can join on invitation. And these different tables, they govern basically the portfolio flow. So accordingly, we started with the portfolio table that is responsible for the vision and strategy. And in order to ritualize this flow, we created a portfolio event, which is a full day event of where we create a roadmap and split the budget. So imagine here, well, enterprise architect, business owners, portfolio management collectively together split the budget to make sure that we align under the same strategy and vision. Then, accordingly, we see that the solution table is there to generate the technical execution plan. This execution plan is there made by chief product owners, product management, department management, and solution train engineers. They really slice, let's say, the MVPs that are created by the portfolio table, and they start creating epics. A primary objective of this table is to identify and manage cross-value stream dependencies. So, and with a value stream, I mean an organizational entity that entails all the capabilities that are needed to deliver a product end-to-end. And you can imagine that different units are in there, and they need to be organized accordingly. As they prepare in their quarterly alignment sessions, in order to make sure that the value streams are then ready to execute. So they need to get ready to execute on the program. So slicing the epics into features and make sure that the teams and the people who are eventually executing upon this are there to make the actual plan that they will execute upon. And by doing so, you really enhance the motivation and creativity because the psychological ownership is there at the people. Finally, you hop in, so the bi-weekly sessions, so the system demos of the teams that are really there to build and implement and validate the hypotheses. And this is also typically where, of course, more and more you come directly to the customer when you start really validating your business hypotheses. So this is a real, well, large example, you could say. And another example is of a large bank where you have one layer less, where the strategic level starts generating OKRs by visualizing all the objectives by quarter on a large wall that is visible for everyone, where the portfolio level there starts breaking them down into epics and smaller pieces. So in the end, in the big planning event, people can there share and align among the same chunks of work that then after this quarterly session are picked up in a fixed cadence by the Scrum team, and the process starts all over.
Okay. So let's zoom into one of these routines. So here was a, oh, can I go back? Yeah. So this is a nice quote from Christina Wodtke, and it's coming from her book of Radical Focus. If you want to learn about strategic objectives and OKRs in general, so objectives, key results, I definitely recommend this book. It's simple, and it gives you an overview of what it means and what it could mean for your organization as well. So how do we break down strategy to short cycle result? Oh, wait. Okay. Can you go back? There's something wrong. Oh, sorry, we'll run into a small problem, but yeah, that's where I was.
There we are again.
Okay, so zooming into the strategy as a journey routine. So what we see. I'm sorry. So now strategy has often been regarded as almost the opposite, as almost the opposite of strategy as a journey. So usually these are big shifts that seem to disrupt the market the moment they are launched. So and therefore in many cases, and at times also successful, I have to add, they're governed in large programs outside the organization. So our take on creating enterprise agility appeals more to a keeping options open strategy, where strategic decisions are made in more of a continuous rhythm. So it emphasizes the minimum viable concept of strategy as well, and allows mistakes to be spotted and corrected before too much effort is devoted to it. So stating your strategic themes as objectives and key results, so detailed in the next slide, provides just the kind of clarity and organizational focus needed for effective portfolio management. So when it comes to impact measurement, the question then moves away from what do we get when it's finished, to something like, how can we tell early on if the chance of success is more or less likely? So how do you break down a strategy to short-cycled OKR? Well, it's good to note what an OKR actually is. So OKRs is something, it stems from Intel, and it's a management tool you could use to break down your strategic theme and give it some more clarity and focus. So first of all, let's look at this via an example. So the objective here is to delight our customers by personalizing our online offer. Now, without it, this qualitative statement can mean still a lot of things to a lot of different people. So what does personalization mean? In one of my previous jobs, where I wasn't working for the Gladwell group, I was responsible for product development, and in there, personalization was one of our biggest challenges. And in fact, the way we described it, it was the amount of data points that we were able to collect on a customer. That was our first step into personalization, because we were not that far. We were just building a database that collected all our customer data. However, you see here in the next example, they can also think of that in totally different ways. You can think of it as reduce revenue cancellations by X%, or increase NPS from X to Y. And you can already see if everybody thinks differently about a certain objective, it can actually work against each other. But if we now, by providing more clarity and focus, and we understand exactly what we mean, and we also understand some of the trade-offs that might happen. OKRs also allow us to do something else. If we are very transparent about what our goals are, and they're for everyone to see, everyone can align their own objectives to the same cause. It's not always possible in a large organization. Obviously, face-to-face communication is always preferred, but it's just not always possible to do that. So therefore, OKRs and describing really well what you try to achieve as a company and as a team helps. So being so explicit and being so adamant about your communication is actually needed in order to get the message across and to get that alignment throughout. And it's not just flowing from top to bottom. In fact, that would only be the vertical types of alignment, but it's definitely also pushed upwards down the chain, where teams realize, because they have more information possibly than some of the teams that work more on the executive level, the management teams, for instance, and they've got this feedback that they need, and they might push for some of the strategic themes and then they get validated, and when they get validated, they get pushed back into the system. So it becomes this kind of continuous flow. And it's not only a vertical flow that I'm talking about, it's also teams that align with peer teams. So for instance, the sales team with the marketing team with the development teams, etc. So to illustrate that with a practical example, a European airline. So a European airline had, as a part of their customer experience strategy, they identified a 3-year mission objective. And it was that was identified itself with annual objectives, which they called strategies. And those strategies and measures, which you can translate to objectives and key results, they were deliberately seeded to a few key departments in order to make it happen. And not only just seeded in a way like you have to do it, but more like, these are our goals that we want to achieve as a company. Now, please, can you assign your own goals and make sure that we all run in the same fashion, because we think it's in our interest to do so. I will not only give you our objectives, but we also give you the means to do so. So they were handed over some facilitation guidance. They were handed over even locations where they can host these sessions with their management teams. And that's how they got a few early adopters on. Now, the interesting thing happened afterwards, because they didn't need to seed it to all teams in the organization, even though that this airline might have had as many as 200 of these teams. They were operating with thousands of people only as head office alone. But the awareness of some of these teams experimenting with their set of objectives it created a kind of snowball effect because management teams, they started to align their objectives with the other departments because they felt that in order to uphold their commitment to others, that they needed to secure their dependencies. And other management teams got curious about this mechanism because they wanted to provide purpose to their teams. So they started to adopt this tool on their own. And then there were even teams that on their own tried to look up what the company objectives were and try to associate their objectives for the next month, the next PI if you're in SAFE, or more the quarterly rhythm. And they started to align their objectives even on their own behalf. So the result that they achieved through this was that the objectives brought the alignment and a sense of purpose to all the teams, including the Scrum teams, where they were successful. And also what we saw is uncoordinated events like hackathons, they began to use the themes with the strategic objectives in mind, which was something that needed to be pushed before, but now almost happened spontaneously. And that also meant that spontaneous new features were drafted by the teams themselves, and they came up with surprises like, hey, we know now that this is the company objective, and this is what we have built for you. So even though that management was not aware that this was being built in the teams, this happened almost spontaneously with events like hackathons, but also just in their normal routine, where they might have anyway have had some leeway to innovate on their own. So let's zoom into the second routine. So the first routine is about the strategy routine, then the portfolio routine brings that back to a little bit more tactical decisions that you need to make. So the portfolio routine is where those collectively responsible for product management and development, they come together and set out the quarterly directions of the teams. So it starts a cycle of alignment usually, as demonstrated in the airlines example that I just shared with you. And it begins a translation of the most promising work packages as epics, if you have them, the bigger rocks. So it might be that also you have a rule, like I don't want to have too many epics because I want to be more decentralized. And that's okay too, because the OKRs cascade and can be aligned with the other teams. They work equally for the bigger work packages and complex challenges that requires a lot of teams to work in the same fashion. As it would for small independent features that teams can iterate on independently. So the portfolio Kanban is usually where you would provide the single overview of all activities that the portfolio team needs to be aware of. And the cadence rituals are designed to support the continuous prioritization of initiatives because this is not a one-off. Okay. So I'll go a little bit faster. So these are some of these are some of the prioritization mechanisms, but we can forward them to you afterwards as well. And this is how objectives and key results can support and actually reinforce the built-in constraint like budget allocation principles, but also the lightweight business cases that you might be used to work with. The way to shortest job first is something, it's not isolated to SAFE, but it's best described there. And I think OKRs have a way to set the bar more than if you, because the shortcoming of weighted shortest job first would be, it's difficult to do over non-comparable sources of value. And actually with OKRs, you already make it clear right up front what it is that you want to do and what you want to achieve. So you set the bar to classify your and measure up your solutions against. Now zooming into the execution routine. So this is really where the teams are used to short cycled goals and to guide their development, and preferably on a sprint by sprint basis, generate the necessary feedback. So that means feedback from the market, if possible, through data or through other collection methods, whatever works for your company. So to avoid the pitfall of the feature factory, it's important that these indicators are as much about the outcome, as we just described, so real customer outcome or behavior driven, as they are an output, with even more relevance assigned to the first for typical, I think, for all the right reasons. One of the things that we do want to highlight is the role of the accelerated learning with big room planning. So plans are useless, but the act of planning is indispensable. There's a famous quote that was attributed to General Eisenhower. So big room planning events are recognized as the ideal learning environment. You learn about dependencies, you learn about risks and opportunities. but you also create a sense of commitment and sort of deal between the portfolio routine and the execution routine, whereby the portfolio routine says, okay, this is really your job. Now you have to fill in how we get to the objectives that we've together established with you. And in return, we'll leave you alone. And in return, the teams really execute and know what to execute on. And for that, we turn to our last example.
Yes, I think it's nice to end with this nice practical example, which is of an energy company where they really implemented this process, where they came with a promise and proof loop where we defined the clearly promise of the what, so define a clear benefit hypothesis and leading indicators and evaluation criteria. So when are we really done? Accordingly, we create commitment by the big room planning. So we really let it to the people to define and commit to it, as you see in the picture, by the confidence vote. So if they're not confident enough, we don't execute. Finally, we track and validate our hypothesis by a system demo where we don't just show PowerPoint presentation, we really test and validate the hypothesis by integrating it on the spot and have it validated by the customer as you should, and therefore closing the promise and proof loop back again. So this was our short example,
yeah,
and also our webinar for the Lean Portfolio Management. So please, if you have any questions, let us know, and we have a couple more minutes to discuss that and dive a little bit more into your specific remarks. Koen, there's a question about will we distribute the slides? I think some of the...
Yeah, I think this is recorded. And actually what we indeed, that brings us to almost the final slide, is if you're interested in a copy, just email us. I think you have our email. So just send us a message and we'll send it to you.
Yeah. So maybe some of the practical examples we cannot fully share, but we can definitely share the majority of the material. Any other questions? How do you suggest? There's a question now.
Any Scrum Masters become CEO? I think actually that would be, indeed, I think every cycle would be helped with someone that guards the team and acts as a servant leader. So if that's what you mean by Scrum Master, I would definitely be for it. And we do see different people take on such roles, even in the executive teams. And also already they were there in the traditional, on the traditional side, and they would be called either chief of staff or secretary to the board. But I think they will, as you'll become more agile, more prone to this short-cycled feedback and servant leadership type necessities, definitely I think the role of the secretary to the board at the executive level, or a Scrum Master role as a portfolio manager, these will appear. I'm pretty sure. And I've seen them in several instances already when it comes to the portfolio routine.
Yeah, and a practical example at the energy company, they, for example, indeed had an agile PMO of the portfolio table where he or she really facilitated this process. So I think all these roles are really important on all levels. There's another question, a practical question coming in from Martin. What did EO stand for in the earlier slide, in the journey slide? It stands for epic owner. So on a portfolio level and also on solution level, you see the role of an epic owner. So this person is responsible for facilitating and guiding an epic, so a large chunk of work in the process. So in comparison to a project manager, this person is not responsible for really finishing this big chunk, but facilitating and making the right decision and bringing the right pieces of work to the right value streams.
Yeah,
that's a significant difference.
So this question is, have you had people or examples of companies using this methodology for non-software development projects? Yes. So just as we see Agile for hardware emerge right now, even OKRs and breaking down strategic themes into strategic objectives with key results, I think that's something that translates all across. So that's easily adopted in a non-development framework. I think in an Agile system, it just works a bit better because the teams are more autonomous. So they're more able to do things on their own, and therefore the kind of objectives and key results that they sign up for become more real and more tangible. As for which tools, Jira, etc., I think if you look up OKRs and tooling, you get a wealth of knowledge already. So there's a wealth of tools that support it, and even, I'm not sure if it's Jira, but even tools that support both, so that translate OKRs directly and connect them to features, etc., like you're used to in Jira. I just don't know if it's Jira per se, but I've seen tools around that do that combine the stuff. Yes.
So then we take, I think, the last question. So a good roadmap planning tool. So to be honest, first of all, we really like to start physically. So we really prefer to start with a physical board with a visual wall so that everyone can see, and we really stimulate the face-to-face communication. And if you cannot manage this, it's really hard to put it then in the tool. So remember here, it's also about people and interactions over processes and tools, of course. So that's really where I ended up. So that's, yeah.
Oh, that's a tricky question. Do you have a preferred scaling methodology? I'll try to stay away from this one, but send me an email and see if I can respond. Because before I can respond to this question, it really depends on your organization and your specifics.
Yeah, and then it all comes down back to the principles behind it, I would say. If you really need to follow them to make it work, and yeah,
that's the right way.
Model is just a virtual classification of the reality. So models can help, but you really need to make keep it to the principles.
Yeah.
So I think
I definitely indeed the poll asked, and that was because some of the terminology was lended from SAFe here. So yes, thanks.
Then last but not least, also here to practice what we preach and to get some feedback from you guys. There's a poll. We want to ask you if you liked it, and by collecting your feedback, how likely are you to recommend this webinar to your colleagues? We really appreciate if you would do this, so we can also improve our own services and make this better next time. So some answers are rolling in. It's really appreciated.
Thanks. And to the audience on the other side of the pond, so to speak, I wish you a good day.
Yeah.
And for the ones in Europe, I wish you a good evening.
Really, thanks a lot for your patience, also due to the technical problems, and we appreciate it. And we hope to see you next time in the next webinar. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks a lot.